for UROPs or other projects, and this is an opportunity for you guys to find out what we're all about. So in my part of the presentation, what I'm going to do is give you a brief overview to some of the issues surrounding urban wildlife ecology, and I'll tell you about the work that I've done, and then I'll tie that into a discussion of bat conservation research. So let me just take a second to remind you of the 5 main threats to biodiversity on Earth using E.O. Wilson's HIPPO acronym, which you should hopefully be familiar with. We're talking about habitat loss, introduction of invasive species, population growth, that's our population, pollution, and of course overharvesting. E.O. Wilson left out one threat, so I've chosen the acronym CHIPPOs from The Simpsons. C stands for climate change. So basically, the process of urbanization epitomizes all of these threats to biodiversity. So what we're talking about are the fact that the urban environment, it's kind of like a microcosm of climate change because of the urban heat island. So heat islands don't contribute very much to global warming, but global warming is expected to worsen the effects of climate change, so urban animals are likely to feel those effects more severely than non-urban animals. And then other human land uses, sure, they may destroy larger pieces of habitat, but nothing does it as irreversibly as urbanization does. Wherever we go, we bring with us certain species, particularly species that tend to do well by being associated with us. These animals may be good at exploiting a wide variety of resources, and they may represent novel predators to native species and consume them in unsustainable numbers. And of course, nowhere is our own population density higher than it is in cities. Pollution is a huge problem in cities, what with the generation of garbage and sewage, as well as the use of fertilizers and pesticides. And of course, people in cities consume huge quantities of energy and non-sustainable products. And in addition to all that, animals have to contend with lots of roads, which can be barriers to their movement, as well as sources of mortality. And windows, which are also problems for animals which basically fly into windows and get killed. And finally, we certainly light up the night and we make a lot of noise, and all of that can be quite disturbing to wildlife. The unfortunate fact is that most ecologists have kind of shied away from working in these not so pristine environments, and some have said, hey, the city's not an ecosystem. And they claim that the only animals that you find in cities are the garbage species, so things like these rhesus macaques and pigeons. But you know what? Cities are ecosystems, and they contain many wildlife species. Some were there prior to development, and others come along as we do, and some species are hanging on by a thread. So on the left here, you see a great gray owl, which is really not a garbage species, and on the right, 2 coyotes, and I took both of these photos in major Canadian cities. So why should you care? Why should you study urban ecology? Because after all, urban areas only occupy a tiny fraction of all of the land on Earth. But the process of urbanization is so drastic and so irreversible. And like I said, it epitomizes all of those primary threats to global biodiversity. So no surprise that it's been identified as the single human land use that most threatens biodiversity on Earth, or conservation. And unfortunately, it's likely to get worse because today, 10 times as many people live in cities compared to 100 years ago, and by 2050, 70% of the world's population, roughly 6.5 billion people, is expected to live in cities. And so this problem, combined with my passion for wildlife, is why I got involved. And before I tell you more about my research, I'll just tell you a bit where I've come from. I've been here for nearly 5 months, and I certainly came a very long way from the other side of the world. Not too far, actually, from where Jesse Hastings comes from. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Canadian geography, but here's my hometown of Montreal in eastern Canada. It's an island, just like Singapore, in the St. Lawrence River, about 500 kilometers north of New York City, and about 15,000 kilometers from Singapore. So very far. I spent most of my life in Montreal, including my first 2 university degrees, which I did at McGill University. First, a Bachelor of Science in Agriculture, and I majored in environmental biology, and I got that out of the way in 1999. And then a Master of Science in Wildlife Biology. And what I studied for my master's was the urban ecology of this bird, the sharp-shinned hawk. And this was the first time that anyone had ever studied this species in an urban area. So just to give you a little bit of background, at this time, bird biologists were really uncertain about population dynamics for this species, and there were concerns that populations were declining, and possibly that could have been because of the effects of certain contaminants in the environment, as well as the loss of good nesting habitat due to urbanization. So basically, previous researchers thought that sharp-shinned hawks absolutely needed this kind of habitat to nest in. So what we're looking at here is a young, dense coniferous or evergreen forest, and that these birds were completely intolerant of human disturbance and therefore unlikely to nest in a city. So I set out to study the effects of pollution and nest habitat use on sharp-shinned hawks in Montreal. The first thing that I did was look at this population's productivity, so how it was reproducing. And I used various methods for that, mostly observational. So what you're looking at here is a mirror that I stuck up on a pole, and you can see there are 4 chicks in the nest, and I would use this to count eggs or count baby birds. And I compared what I found with results that were published for the same species in other locations. And among other things, what I found was that the average numbers of eggs the birds were laying, the numbers of eggs that were hatching, and the percentage of nests that hatched at least 1 egg, all of those were fairly normal. As for nesting success, so that's the percentage of nests that managed to successfully produce 1 baby bird to the point where it flies away, that was quite variable, and because it was very, very low in one particular year, overall productivity seemed quite low, which was concerning. However, it was most likely due to the fact that that 1 year was very cold and wet. So if you're a mother bird and it's cold and wet outside, you need to spend a lot of time sheltering the eggs and sheltering the nestlings, and your mate is not going to do such a good job of bringing back enough prey by himself. What's interesting, though, is that I found a lot of birds breeding in their first year. Normally, there are not a lot of 1-year-old birds that breed, and the fact that there were so many could have been an indication that the urban area was actually good for nesting. The next thing I looked at was contaminant levels. So what I'm talking about here are, Okay, so what I was interested in was looking at what were the levels of contaminants to which these birds were exposed. And when I'm talking about contaminants, I was concerned with organochlorines. So these are chlorinated hydrocarbons, primary or best known as DDT, and that's an insecticide. And the problem is these chemicals stick around in the environment for a really long time, and they bioaccumulate in wildlife, particularly in top predators like sharp-shinned hawks. And DDT interferes with bird reproduction by causing females to lay eggs that are very fragile. And so I was quite interested in this. So to measure contaminant levels, I trapped the hawks using a net, and then once I had both of the parents, I could restrain them and then climb up to the nest and lower down the nestlings. And then finally, everybody had to provide a blood sample so that these could be analyzed for contaminant levels. So here are my results, and what I did was compare what I found with levels that were measured in the same species as they were flying south for the winter from a very wide geographic region, including individuals from my breeding population. So first of all, most substances occurred at very low levels, except for DDE, which is the main metabolite of DDT, and PCBs, which are polychlorinated biphenyls, and those are used in the manufacture of electrical insulators. Now, DDT was widely used all over the world and was banned in North America in 1970s, but because it sticks around in the soil and water for so long, animals can still ingest it. And the question was whether the birds were actually coming into contact with this substance on their Montreal breeding grounds. However, for a number of reasons, I was able to determine that this exposure was occurring in the wintertime where they were in Central America and where DDT continues to be used. As for PCBs, those were banned in Canada in the 80s. However, they continue to be discharged into the environment, especially in Montreal, where very large quantities of these chemicals were used. However, again, my results indicated that this contamination was not happening in my study area, but instead was the result of global contamination of the environment. And in fact, if you test women from the Arctic, you will find that their breast milk has the highest quantities of PCBs anywhere in the world. So the entire world is contaminated with PCBs. Finally, I found absolutely no relationship between the levels of organochlorines in a mum and the chances that she would be successful nesting. So these contaminants didn't seem to be high enough to be affecting reproduction. The last thing I did was looked at whether this bird was using nest habitat differently to other rural populations. And as I said, people just thought that this bird couldn't nest in an urban setting and that it needed this young, dense forest. So like this fellow is doing, I set up transects and measured a number of vegetation variables. So what I found for certain parameters that are related to forest structure and urbanization, I compared with previously published values. And the first thing is distance to the edge. So let's say a road or a path or a field, and naturally you're going to expect that to be lower in an urban area, and of course that's exactly what I found. As for stand age, when you look at an urban forest, basically they will cut down a lot of the small understory trees, and so the forest tends to have an older age structure. Again, that's exactly what I found. However, none of the parameters that I looked at that are related to urbanization and forest structure, so things like tree density, forest age, distance to the edge, none of those were related to nesting success of these birds. So what did I get out of this project? Basically, urbanization was not impairing the productivity of sharp-shinned hawks. The birds were reproducing normally, and although they were exposed to fairly high levels of certain organochlorines, this was not impairing their reproduction, and the exposure wasn't happening on their breeding grounds. Moreover, other authors had found that many raptors are equally productive or even more productive in urban areas as in non-urban areas. However, this bird needs forests. So if cities want to maintain certain species, they need to maintain the habitat that the species requires. And similarly, if you just look at things like numbers, you're not going to get at the real questions that you're interested in answering. So studying demography is quite important. So I actually quit school in 2002 so that I could work and earn some money, but then I went back to school in 2005 and moved to Calgary, Alberta, which is about 4,000 kilometers west of Montreal and about 20,000 kilometers from here. And I went to do a PhD at the University of Calgary, and I was studying the effects of urbanization on bats in the prairies. So the term prairies may be new for you, but basically this is what we're talking about. A grassland landscape consisting of rolling plains. It mostly looks like this. And this is one of Canada's regions that is most altered by human activity, particularly agricultural activity. And you also find some low-lying river valleys with trees and, most importantly, bats. So my master's work showed that the dominant view that wild animals can't do well in cities needed some revising. In addition, when I started, there were some pretty important biases in the field, and I wanted to address these. So I'll just show you those one by one. So first of all, most researchers, including me, had worked in temperate forests, particularly in North America and Europe. And there, the process of urbanization means deforestation. So this is a photo of Montreal showing deforestation. On the other hand, very few had worked in grassland landscapes like the prairies, where urbanization is happening really fast. And it's pretty hard not to notice that a city in the prairies is like a vertical island sticking up out of the flat landscape. And because we humans like to maintain roughly 30 to 40% tree cover in all cities everywhere, that means that when you put a city in a grassland landscape, you add trees and you add vertical landscape elements. So it occurred to me that for animals that need vertical landscape elements, maybe the effects of urbanization would be different in that landscape. The next bias was methodological. So basically, most urban ecologists have looked at things from the perspective of the community or the assemblage. So they know a lot about how it affects diversity and abundance and a lot less about how it affects individuals and populations. However, in my master's, as I told you, I became convinced of the need to look at demography, and so convinced of the need for a bottom-up approach. So here's an example to illustrate why this is important. This character is the closely related Cooper's hawk, and in the 90s, they found that there were lots and lots of these nesting in the city of Tucson, Arizona, much more so than outside the city. And so that led to the conclusion that, hey, the city is good for Cooper's hawks. However, when researchers looked a little more closely, they found that actually nesting success was much lower in the city than outside the city, and that was because Cooper's hawks were feeding their nestlings doves like that, which had a disease that was transmissible to the babies. And so this high density of birds was basically because individuals were coming in from outside, and the city was becoming what we call an ecological trap. Last, I too was guilty of focusing on birds. So urban ecology has pretty much just looked at birds. Why? Because birds are easy to work with, they're sexy, and easy to see. And there had not been very many studies of mammals. And among studies of urban mammals, there certainly has not been enough attention to bats. And that's really unfortunate for many reasons. First of all, a quarter of all mammals are bats. Next, if you like bananas, you should thank bats because they provide very essential ecosystem services beyond just pollinating banana flowers. They disperse seeds, no bats, no figs, and they are the main animals that control populations of nocturnal insects, like mosquitoes. because bats have a really slow life history, so they reproduce really slowly and they live an extremely long time, like tiny little flying elephants, that means that when something happens and their populations decline, it takes them a long time to recover. So these animals are good indicators of habitat quality. And finally, I thought the fact that bats can fly and are nocturnal would make them a little less vulnerable than other small vertebrates to some of the other problems of city life. In other words, getting hit by cars, roads being barriers to their movements, as well as human disturbance. Of course, there is the problem of light and noise, which we don't really know too much about when it comes to bats. So I started out with this crazy hypothesis that actually urbanization was good for bats in the prairies. And I had a number of reasons for thinking that that was true. So, first of all, I thought that prairie bats would find more roosts in the city. So a roost is one of the most important habitat elements for a bat. Basically, that's where he spends the day. So some roosts are trees, okay, so they're natural roosts, but other bats use man-made roosts like buildings or bridges, and I expected that the urban abundance of trees and buildings in the prairies would benefit these bats. I also thought that urbanization would increase food availability. So all bats in Canada are insectivorous, and insectivorous bats are ravenous. These guys eat up to 1/2 their body weight in insects in a single night. However, the main land uses in the prairies are very harmful to insects. Mainly that's because cattle ranching, the cattle trample the vegetation, they remove the vegetation, and they dirty the streams and erode the landscape. Plus, most farming in Alberta is conventional, so that means lots of pesticides and fertilizers, both of which are harmful to insects. Since we don't practice agriculture in the city, I thought the city would be more, or would offer the bats more food to eat. And therefore that bats would spend more time foraging. And finally, temperature is really important to bats. When it's warmer, there are more insects. As well, having a warmer roost benefits reproduction. And so I thought that the urban habitat would therefore be preferred because of the urban heat island. So this is where I worked. It just looks like a white line, but those are the city limits of Calgary, Alberta, which is the fastest growing Canadian city and is also a very large city with extreme urban sprawl. So I had different kinds of sites. I had urban sites, which you can see here, that were within the city and totally surrounded by development. And then I had rural sites, which were at least 40 kilometers away from the city. And then I had what I call transition sites, which were in between, or else they were on the city limits, but not completely surrounded by urbanization. And I wanted to make sure that I had the transition zone as a buffer between the urban and rural bat assemblages, so I wasn't double counting, if you want to say, bats. And this is to show you what the sites looked like. They were all riparian, which means the interface between land and a river or stream, and that's where you find bats in the prairies. And it was important to make sure that all my sites looked similar, so I could know that whatever I was finding was due to the effects of urbanization and not, let's say, presence or absence of trees. So when it comes to the effects of urbanization on bat assemblage structure, previous studies generally found fewer bats and less diverse bats in the city. And we know that bat diversity is related to the habitat heterogeneity and the availability of roosts, both of which are beneficial. So under my crazy hypothesis that a prairie city represents an island of attractive habitat, I expected urbanization to enhance both the abundance and diversity of bats. So how do you study this? The first method basically involves eavesdropping. So we can't hear echolocation, but we can put a bat detector that can record echolocation and produce a spectrogram like this. So what you see here is time on the x-axis and sound frequency in kilohertz on the y-axis. And I could put these detectors out in my sites and tell who was flying around and how many bats there were. In this case, you can see the white lines. Each of those is a bat call. One bat is calling at a higher frequency and with calls closer together in time than this other bat, which is calling down between 30 and 25 kilohertz. The bat that's calling at the lower frequency is a larger bat, just like bigger people have lower voices. However, bat detectors aren't perfect. They have certain biases. So it's better to combine your acoustic data with capture data, and besides, catching bats is tons of fun. So I used mist nets to catch bats every single night for 3 summers. And what I recorded was bat abundance and diversity. In all, I captured more than 2,000 bats and recorded nearly 200 nights of acoustic data. So this was the most comprehensive urban bat study that was ever conducted. And thanks to those data, I discovered that, as I expected, given a positive effect of urbanization, urban bats were indeed more abundant. But remember what I said before, don't just look at numbers, because urban bats were not more diverse. In other words, there were fewer species, and the numbers of individuals were less evenly distributed among those species. In fact, everywhere this character dominated. This was the most common bat, this little brown bat. However, nowhere more so was he more dominant than in the city. In fact, it was in the rural zone that bats were the most diverse. Interestingly, this character, the long-eared bat, was only found in the rural zone. And why I say that's interesting is because unlike all of the other bats in my study area, which when they hunt insects, they basically echolocate and they catch insects on the wing, this guy is listening for the sounds of insects' feet and wings on the vegetation, and then he goes and picks them off. The fact that I only found him in the rural zone, where it was quieter, made me wonder maybe it was just too noisy for this hunting style, which we call gleaning in the city. The next thing I looked at was food. And I already told you about how the main land uses in the prairies are bad for insects. And we certainly know that bat foraging activity is linked to prey availability. So given a positive effect of no agriculture in the city, then I expected urban insects to be more abundant and more diverse, and urban bats to spend more time eating. So how do you look at what's on the menu? Good times. You put up sticky traps, and I put up 3 traps every night at different heights, and insects unfortunately have to be sacrificed, like this crane fly, and then the next morning I would get up and remove all the insects, identify them, count them, measure them. It's very, very busy. The bat detectors also can record when bats emit what are called feeding buzzes. So as the bat gets closer and closer to its target, it has to start calling faster and faster, and eventually it emits what is called a feeding buzz. So it's a rapid series of calls, and I will try and play one now. And if it doesn't work, well, that's just life. We'll see. Okay, so that little zipper sound, I would listen to all of these files and count these little zipper sounds as an indication of how much bats were eating. Here's what I found. So again, I expected to find more insects in the city, but I didn't. I also expected urban insects to be more diverse, but you know what? They weren't. Rural insects were the most diverse. Also, midges, which are tolerant of pollution, were most abundant in the city and least abundant in the rural zone. And my data also did not support the prediction that urban bats forage more. So overall, absolutely no support for my hypotheses or predictions about prey availability or foraging. And although I thought no agriculture in the city would benefit insects and bat foraging, it is possible for urban streams to be more polluted than streams in agricultural landscapes and to have fewer insects. Last is the demographic stuff. So this was the first demographic comparison of urban and non-urban bats. And I chose little brown bats because of, well, how many of them there were. And under my overall hypothesis that urbanization benefits prairie bats, I expected urban bats to be, well, the fittest. So that certainly could explain why little browns were more abundant in the city than anywhere else. And again, I expected that to be because of more roosts, more prey, greater foraging activity, and warmer temperatures. So, I'm assuming that most people here are not too familiar with the life history of a bat. The key word is slow. So, these are the longest lived mammals for their body size. Some of them live 40 years. In the temperate zone, bats only give birth once a year, and most species only have one pup each time they give birth, and that is the case for little brown bats. And ladies should be glad they're not a bat, because if you were, you'd be having a baby about 30 pounds. Bad times. The biggest problem for bats in Canada and all over the temperate zone is that time is really short. Okay? So we have a very short summer, and that's when insects are available. The rest of the year, there's nothing to eat. Bats during that time have to reproduce. They have to get ready for winter hibernation. They've got to pack on the fat, and packing on the fat just is not compatible with reproduction because giving or producing milk takes a lot of energy, so therefore you can't really gain weight when you're nursing, and the pups cannot be weaned and start to fly until they reach adult size. So lactation is very costly, and so is sperm production. Males have to produce all of their sperm during the summer when there's food available. And because bats in the temperate zone use what we call torpor, meaning they lower their body temperature every single day so that they can save energy, this is not compatible with reproduction either. So bats in cooler roosts have to use more energy to maintain their body temperature, and that delays reproduction. It reduces production of milk and production of sperm and makes pregnancy take longer, and it makes it take longer for bats to start flying. So, to assess fitness, I measured a number of different parameters, and one of those was body condition. So basically, how good of a hunter are you, and how likely are you to survive the winter? That's what I was interested in. So basically, if you're a fat bat like this one, you're probably going to do well over the winter. So I would weigh and measure all the bats. I know, they're really cute. And then I looked at their productivity or their reproductive rates. What proportion of adults are reproducing? So I would assess reproductive status by looking at them. So is this female reproductive, meaning is she pregnant, is she lactating, or is she post-lactating like this one? Post-lactating means your pup has already flown away. And then reproductive males included the ones that were producing and storing sperm. I also considered reproductive success for males and females. So for females, basically I measured the proportion of juveniles in the population. It's really easy. You hold the bat's wing in front of the light, and if you see light passing through that gap in the knuckle, then you know it's a juvenile. Measuring male reproductive success, they may not have appreciated this, but I measured the length of the testes and the organs where they store sperm. And that tells me basically how much sperm these bats are producing. And this is what I found. So I expected that if urbanization increases food availability, which of course wasn't true, and foraging activity, then urban bats should be in better condition. In other words, heavier for their size. But that wasn't true. Bats in the transition zone were in the best condition. I also expected enhanced reproduction by bats in the city, but they were no more likely to reproduce than non-urban bats. The proportion of juveniles was not highest in the city, which is not what I expected, and I did not find that urban males were producing more sperm. So guess what? Overall, it looks like urbanization is bad for bats. There were certainly a lot of little brown bats in the city, and so the city may be really attractive to them because there's a lot of roosts or for whatever other reason, but that doesn't mean that it's a good place for them to live. And this underscores what I've been saying from the beginning. You can't just look at density. You have to look at what's going on at the level of the individual and the population to really understand habitat quality. In the transition zone was where bats generally seem to do best. Coincidentally, in the transition zone was where bats were most likely to be roosting in natural roosts in trees. And bats in tree roosts form smaller groupings than bats in building roosts. And so I wondered whether this is just a case of the city just being too crowded, a little bit like Singapore sometimes. So the thing is that nobody has ever shown that actually there is food competition among insectivorous bats. But I suspect that my data are pointing towards that conclusion. So this could be a very interesting question for somebody to study. It certainly would make a paper in ecology or nature. A couple of other things, or a few other things that I'm interested in, basically have to do with the things I didn't get to look at yet, but which I hope to do. So there are other problems with city life for wildlife. First of all, we know that lights attract insects and that bats hunt insects around the lights. In fact, they hunt insects at the street lamp right across from my apartment here in Singapore. And what we don't know yet is whether these lights interfere with the time that bats leave their roost or the time they go back to their roost. So that's a very interesting question to study. A couple of studies have found that traffic noise interferes with foraging by those listening bats that I told you about before. What we don't know is whether it interferes with foraging by the ones that are catching insects in the air. Something else to look at. Now, although I expected that predation wouldn't be a problem in the city for bats, later studies showed that indeed it can be, and that there can be more predators of bats in the city than outside, but there certainly needs more, this question needs more investigation. And last, some birds have experienced increased stress. City life is just stressful, but we just don't know whether that is the case for bats or not. Now, if this picture, which I know is super cute, isn't enough to convince you that bats are deserving of future study, remember all of the important things that bats do for us. We're already having problems in North America because of declining bat populations in terms of insect pests on crops and increased populations of mosquitoes. These are the most diverse mammals, and to lose them would be really quite tragic. Because these guys have such a slow life history, that means that if populations decline, it can take an extremely long time for them to recover. And because bats actually form the largest groupings of mammals on Earth, one single catastrophic event can devastate populations or entire species. What's happening now in North America is that nearly 1/2 of all bats are declining or are endangered, and unfortunately that is the case everywhere in the world, including in Southeast Asia. And so I'm already getting involved in bat projects here in Singapore, and I hope to continue to do that. And that's it. That's a cue. See, the big brown bat is asking the little brown bat. Any questions? You're asking me if there are other studies in urban ecology here in Southeast Asia? So there are studies being done all over the world of urban wildlife ecology. People are still focusing a lot on birds, but there are studies happening here at NUS. So there is tremendous interest, for example, in palm civets, which are these carnivorous mammals that are present in Singapore. Singapore has actually a lot of urban wildlife. So if you're interested in that, in doing an urban wildlife study, it doesn't have to be about bats. I work with other things as well. So you should come talk to me and I can put you in touch with other profs who are looking at that. Does that answer your question? Okay.
That was very fascinating. A question about your master's thesis research. Can you say anything about the minimum size of forests needed in cities to sustain a hawk population?
That's a great question. Well,
And the second question, two bats fight. How many times have you been bitten?
okay, so I'll answer the second question first. I actually can't answer that. Countless times I've been bitten by bats, and they can bite extremely hard, depending on the species. As for the first question, that's very interesting because the minimum forest size is actually, from what I saw, quite small. So for example, I had one nest that was located right beside a picnic table, and even though people would picnic there, the birds would spend pretty much the entire lunch hour attacking the people. And the size of the forest consisted of just a few trees, but the birds still successfully managed to raise at least one chick to independence. So I suspect that it's a lot smaller than what people think. However, all of the forests were well covered. This particular forest was around, or this tract of trees was around 1 hectare. So it was really quite small.
Can I ask a very inflammatory question? It's very close to my heart. You mentioned how populations of bats are declining or endangered. Given their role in transmitting disease to humans, shouldn't we welcome their decline?
So bats, that's a very interesting question. In fact, so what Dr. Hastings is referring to is the fact that a lot of the diseases that we know originated in bats. So things like Ebola virus, rabies, Lissa virus started in bats. However, bats don't really transmit any diseases of importance directly to us. What's happening is that a bat's immune system is extremely similar to the the viruses and infectious agents that infect bats tend to have very similar genetics to the agents that infect us. And so these organisms can mutate very easily and sort of make the jump to another species. If you don't handle bats, you won't have a problem. And when I do presentations in schools, I always end with a caveat slide at the end saying, don't pick up the bat, even though it's really cute, because if a bat bites you, of course, it can transmit a disease. No, I would not say that we should welcome the demise of bats. So, for example, in your home state of Massachusetts, there is a huge problem. You have lost most of your bats. Massachusetts, New York, Vermont, Connecticut, now it's starting in Quebec, New Brunswick, Ontario, and it's spreading all over North America because of a disease. And what's happening is that, in fact, mosquito populations are increasing, and even more than the transmission of diseases by bats to humans is the problem of the transmission of diseases by mosquitoes to humans. And a good example in North America is the disease West Nile virus, which is expected to increase because numbers of bats are decreasing. And besides, I love bats. So. So that slide that I showed you, those are things that I'm interested in. I'm new here. So far what I've actually become involved in is a project looking exactly at the disease dynamics between bats and humans, and I'm volunteering on that project. And I'm starting to work with a postdoc who's interested in the effects of mining activity on bats in Southeast Asia, so gold mining, which inputs a lot of mercury into the environment. I've been asked to conduct a bat survey for Wildlife Reserve Singapore and Singapore Botanic Gardens. And so whatever projects come my way, I intend to take them, particularly if they relate to bats. And wherever I can put into that questions of urban wildlife ecology, that's what I hope to do. It's a little bit different being a lecturer than a professor. You have to kind of find research where you can do it and find your opportunities where you can. But any students who are interested to do this kind of stuff should come see me. Well, if there are no questions, I'm going to turn over to the floor to my esteemed colleague, Jesse Hastings.
Let me see if it'll work for me. I guess I can't.